Ah, now close your eyes and listen to me carefully, because I'm going to take you back in time to the turbulent and epic days of medieval Europe. On one side, England, the mighty kingdom of the Misty Islands. On the other, France, with its majestic castles and fertile lands. These two great countries will be entwined not just by a war, but by a century of endless struggle, the 100 Years' War. This war was not a simple struggle for the throne, no. It was a story that reshaped the destiny of two nations, a story written in the blood of peoples, a story that changed the history of Europe forever. But how did it begin? Why were two neighboring kingdoms so willing to shed each other's blood for so many years? The seeds of this struggle go back much further, even to the marriage beds of noble families. Here, once again, history shows us that human passions and ambitions know no bounds. But, dear listener, take your time. I will tell you this epic step by step, with its heroes, betrayals, triumphs, and sorrows. First, let's go back to where it all began. Are you ready to learn about the past ties between England and France, and how the first spark of this bloody war was ignited? Let's get started. Ha 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 ha! My dear friends, I invite you now to peel back the foggy curtains of time, because to understand the origins of the 100 Years' War, we must look back centuries to the relationships shaped by the conquests of the Normans. This story begins not only on the battlefields, but in the throne rooms, in the palaces of noble families, and in the complex knots of dynastic marriages. It all began in 1066 with the great event that changed the fate of England, the Norman invasion. William the Conqueror, the ambitious leader of Normandy, a small duchy in the north of France, conquered England and established a kingdom. But this victory not only shaped England, it created a complex bond between the two neighboring lands. With William as King of England, the monarchs of England also became dukes with vast territories in France. And this was the first knot that laid the foundation for future conflicts. Imagine a king ruling a kingdom, and at the same time being under the rule of another king as a vassal in neighboring lands. This created a permanent tension between France and England. As the descendants of the Norman kings grew up, this bond became more complex. Through marriages, land disputes, and inheritance disputes, the fates of the two kingdoms became increasingly intertwined. The kings of England owned vast French territory stretching from Normandy to Aquitaine. For France, these territories were not only a threat, but also a wound of pride. And so, amidst these dynastic knots, the year 1328 arrived. France's powerful Capet dynasty had come to an end. With the death of King Charles IV, the throne of France was suddenly unclaimed. The fact that a Capet dynasty had left no male heir sparked a major crisis in Europe. The king's inner circle and the French nobility were scrambling to determine the new owner of the throne. But you must remember that a vacancy on the throne in such a situation is not just a matter for one country. It becomes an international problem. Because power is always looking for new owners, my dear friends. And it was at this point that the young King Edward III of England appeared on the scene. Edward's mother was Isabella, the sister of King Charles IV of France. Edward thought that this connection would give him a claim to the throne of France. "I should be the King of France," he cried, perhaps within the stone walls of his palace in London. But the French nobles did not accept Edward's claim. The throne was handed over to the Valois family, Philip VI. Philip made history as the first Valois king to ascend the throne of France, while Edward III's pride and ambition suffered a deep wound. At that moment, the first spark of this great war was lit. But it wasn't just about the struggle for the throne. England and France were rivals not only over dynastic issues, but also over trade routes, ports, and economic interests. Edward's claim was only a pretext to turn this conflict into a bigger conflagration. England's desire to extend its influence over France collided with France's demand for independence and power. And so these two great nations were dragged into a war that would ravage Europe for a full century. So, think now, my dear friends, what was the young King of England's plan as he prepared to go to war to claim the throne he thought was rightfully his? And how would France respond to this strong claim? We will look for the answers to these questions in the next part of our story. Are you ready? My dear friends, I will now take you to the heart of medieval Europe, a world woven like a spider's web of complex relationships and power plays. At the height of the 100 Years' War, it was a time of not only throne fights, but also a time when the feudal order and the balance of power were deeply shaken. To think that the rivalries between France and England were merely dynastic struggles would be to underestimate the magnitude of this story. For here we will understand how land, wealth, and power became the cause of war. In what we call medieval Europe, the feudal order was the backbone of society. Now imagine, there is a system spread over vast territories. The king sits at the top. Just below him are nobles such as dukes, counts, and barons. At the bottom are the serfs who cultivate the lands of these lords. However, I must say that this order is much more complex than it seems, especially between great kingdoms like France and England. The kings of England, since the Norman invasion we mentioned earlier, have owned large tracts of land in France. At this point, an interesting dilemma arose between the two kingdoms. The King of England was also a vassal of the King of France. The monarchs of England had to swear allegiance to the kings of France because of their territories in France. But when one king bows his knee to another, pride is bruised, my friends. The kings of England have never been able to stomach this. They claimed to be independent monarchs, while the kings of France saw this subordination as a sign of their power. This feudal contradiction was a source of tension for both sides for many years. But this was not only a political issue. The feudal order also had a great economic weight. Land was the greatest wealth of this period. The produce from the fields was returned to the kings and nobles in the form of both taxes and soldiers. England's possession of vast French territories gave it not only a political but also an economic advantage. But remember, my friends, with every advantage comes a responsibility. Protecting, administering, and raising revenues from these territories required a great deal of effort. Britain's economic interests became a constant source of trouble in its relations with France. Let us now talk a little about the power of trade. In the Middle Ages, trade enabled the growth of cities and the emergence of a new class, the bourgeoisie. Ports and trade routes were as valuable to kings as gold. One of England's economic interests over France was to control these trade routes. Especially the Flanders region was one of the most important trade centers in Europe during this period. While England earned a huge income from the wool trade, France was trying to turn this economic dependence in its favor. And what about armies? My friends, war is not only about brave soldiers and shining swords. Financing armies was one of the biggest problems of the medieval kingdoms. Taxes had to be raised, trade revenues diverted. England and France spent huge amounts of resources on this war. Mercenaries in particular became a decisive factor in the fate of wars. The loyalty of mercenaries depended solely on the amount of gold you paid, and this gold was the result of heavy taxes collected from the people. Now think, my dear friends, what must these complex relationships, economic balances, and political conflicts have brought England and France to? And how would the powerful Valois dynasty of France use these feudal networks and economic advantages? In the next chapter, we will witness the first sparks of war and how these two great nations were preparing for a confrontation. Are you ready? Aye, my dear friends, those days when dark clouds hung in the skies over Europe, when countries drew swords against each other, England and France, two proud kingdoms, saw in each other's eyes not only a threat but a challenge. And the first sparks of this great war flared in the verdant lands of the Duchy of Guyenne. I will now take you on a journey through the world of 1337, following the struggle of Edward and the Valois dynasty for the throne, and the echoes of the great victory at Crécy. Although the official start of the war was announced in 1337, it was only the first move in a much deeper struggle. Guyenne, the modern Bordeaux region, was a territory controlled by England but under the shadow of France. The kings of France saw British rule over Guyenne as a thorn in their side, for it was not just a piece of land. It was a strategic region enriched by wine production and crossed by trade route. For both sides, control of this region was not only a matter of economic but also of political prestige. Thus, when King Philippe VI of France revived his claim to Guyenne, Edward's patience ran out. Edward III wanted not only Guyenne, but also the throne of France. He was descended from his grandfather, King Philippe IV of France, and argued that he had a right of inheritance. However, the House of Valois had already denied this right and ascended the throne of France. For Edward, this was not just a blood feud, but a battle to defend the honor of his nation. If England's presence on French soil was to be questioned, then war was inevitable. And so, in 1337, Edward formally laid claim to the throne of France, and the conflicts between the two great kingdoms finally flared up. But my friends, battlefields are not just places where swords clash. Strategy, intelligence, and sometimes technology are powerful enough to change the course of history. And in 1346, at a place called Crécy, England's longbows changed the course of history. The Battle of Crécy was a glorious victory for England. On that day, Edward's army stood against a numerically superior French force. The French, in the old chivalric tradition, placed their cavalry in the center of the battle. But the English plan was to subvert these traditions. English longbows. Ah, my friends, those bows. These weapons, used by ordinary archers of the British Army, revolutionized the warfare of the time. The range of the longbow was powerful enough to pierce the armor of the cavalry. When the French army rushed into battle with great chivalric pride, death rained from the sky. Edward's archers kept up their attack with discipline and patience, while the French knights melted in the rain. England triumphed. The Battle of Crécy was not just a battle, but a turning point that consolidated England's hold on French territory. And then Calais, that port town, my dear friends, became England's gateway to France. After Crécy, the English army captured Calais in 1347. This city was a great gain for England due to its strategic location and economic importance. The capture of Calais by the English meant that one of the lifelines of France was cut. England would now be more comfortable in moving troops and resources into French territory. But these victories were only the beginning. All the while, anger was growing in France, and England was making plans to add to her victories. But, my dear friends, wars are never remembered only for victories. Every victory has a price. Every victory has a shadow. We will now turn to the next chapter to see how this war spread far and wide, and how both nations were tested. In the years that followed Crécy, would England's dominance really last? Wait and see. My dear friends, you know that history is sometimes the cruelest teacher. Apart from the horrors of wars, the cruel hand of nature met another catastrophe that devastated humanity. Between 1347 and 1351, the lands of Europe were watered not only with blood but also with disease. People had grown accustomed to the sound of swords. But this time, an invisible enemy ravaged the continent, the Black Death. And in those days, even the Great War that broke out between England and France had to stop for a short time in the face of this devastating epidemic. Let's take a look back at those days of terror. The plague, my friends, even to describe it is heartbreaking. At first, it was heard from the caravans of distant lands. Starting in the interior of Asia, this deadly epidemic traveled along the Silk Road and reached the heart of Europe through Mediterranean ports. It was 1347, the year the Black Death first set foot on the European stage. It spread from merchant ships docking in the ports of Sicily. The disease soon enveloped the continent like a dark shroud, beginning with a cough, followed by black spots, and eventually leading to death. Within a few days, this epidemic took no mercy on anyone. Cities emptied, villages fell silent, and the streets reeked of death. Marketplaces that were once bustling were now massed grave sites. My dear friends, in these dark days, almost a third of Europe's population fell to the ground. People lost not only their loved ones, but also their social order. Among the peasants, the backbone of the feudal system, Fear and death spread to such an extent that the lords found it difficult to find laborers to cultivate their fields. The farms that supplied the armies for war were abandoned, trade routes were closed, and the treasuries of the kingdoms were rapidly depleted. In England and France, not only peasants but even noblemen and church leaders were helpless against this death. This epidemic was cutting the lifeblood not only of people, but also of societies. And what about war? My dear friends, even war paused in the face of the horrors of the Black Death. The swords that England and France pointed at each other were lowered for a time. Neither King Edward VI of England nor King Philippe VI of France could muster enough soldiers on the battlefields, because in order to recruit soldiers, it was first necessary to find survivors. As both sides waited for the death storm to subside, they looked for ways to regroup their forces. Despite the devastation caused by the pandemic, France tried to organize its internal resources. Feudal lords set about revitalizing devastated villages. Even though the tax collection system had almost collapsed, new taxes were introduced to fill the king's coffers. However, this brought with it growing popular anger. England, on the other hand, seemed relatively unaffected by the epidemic, but the fear and loss suffered by its people disrupted their preparations for war. Edward tried to buy time to prepare his army for future battles, relying on revenues from maritime trade. But the Black Death did not only bring death, my dear friends. It was a turning point that reshaped societies. As Europe's rural landscape changed, the feudal order began to crumble. The surviving peasants realized that their labor had become more valuable and began to demand more rights from their landowners. This was the first spark of the great social transformations to come. And so, as the shadow of the Black Death slowly receded, England and France began to gather their forces to return to war. But this war would no longer be the same war. So what surprises did this great conflict, reignited in the wake of the Black Death, hold? What heroes and tragedies would be engraved on the pages of history in the next phase of the war? Let's keep going, my friends. My dear friends, I am going to tell you about a battle in which the flash of swords and the agility of minds stand at the center of the story. In the year 1356, the conflict between England and France had flared up again. This time, it would be the genius of a prince and the tragedy of a king that would decide the fate of the war. If you are ready, let's step into the blood-scented lands of the Battle of Poitiers together. The year was 1356. Edward, aka the Black Prince, son of England's legendary King Edward III, was determined to make his mark in France. Known for his quick wit and strategic thinking, the young prince was ready to take his father's lessons to the field. Unlike the French, the British forces were disciplined and experienced soldiers. Once again, the British longbow stood out as a weapon that would change the fate of the war. Remember, my dear friends, how these longbows had shattered the pride of the French knights at Crécy, and at Poitiers, this story would be rewritten. On the French side, King Joan II marched with his army, hoping for a great victory. But this was a battle not only of arms, but also of strategy. The Black Prince faced the outnumbered French army by pretending to retreat. My friends, it was only a deception. The prince drew his army into a narrow space near Poitiers, and calculated that the enemy would be trapped there. When the French went on the offensive, thinking they could easily defeat the British army, they were met with a rain of arrows from British longbows. This narrow space limited the maneuverability of the French heavy cavalry and threw them into chaos. The day ended in disaster for the French army. King Jean II and his sons fought at the forefront of the battle, but their bravery was not enough to prevent defeat. When the French troops dispersed, King Jean II was taken prisoner by the soldiers of the Black Prince. Ah, my dear friends, for a king to lay down his sword and surrender would have been a severe blow not only to his honor, but to the honor of an entire nation. For the French people, it was a moment of shame that will be hard to forget. And what about England? The great victory at Poitiers once again cemented England's superiority over France. The Black Prince went down in history not only as a commander but also as a statesman. But the real impact of this victory would be felt not only on the battlefield, but also at the negotiating table. Signed in 1360, the Treaty of Bretigny gave England great advantages. The French agreed to release King Jean II in exchange for a large ransom. At the same time, England gained control over large areas of France, which meant that the war was turning in England's favor. But, dear friends, the wheels of history never stop turning. What may seem like a great victory for England, it is important to remember that France will not yield, and the resistance will only intensify. How would France recover after this war, when the shadow of the Black Prince was everywhere? Which heroes would the French people bring to the stage to regain their lost honor? We will meet the answers to these questions in the next episode. Ah, my friends, you may find that victories on the battlefields are sometimes far from determining the real victor of the period that follows. I will now tell you of a time when reason and patience, rather than the power of the sword, prevailed. France seemed to be brought to its knees by the heavy defeat at Poitiers and the captivity of King Jean II. But the cycle of history has shown us once again that the spirit of a nation can never be completely defeated. And that spirit was revived under a new leader, Charles V, the wise king. Let's witness together the rebirth of France from the ashes. When Charles V ascended the throne of France in 1364, the country resembled a war-torn ruin. The people were writhing in poverty, and the land was being trampled under the boots of enemy armies. But Charles was more than a military king. He was a leader who knew how to rule with wisdom and strategy. He was a leader through a patient and systematic approach. Therefore, his first order of business was to reorganize the army and the economy. Instead of sending countless soldiers to gain the upper hand on the battlefield, he created a more mobile and effective army of mercenaries. He unified France's scattered defensive lines and developed a defense system based on castles. But, my dear friends, Charles' real secret was to discover and trust the talented people around him. There was one man who shone at this time, and that was Bertrand du Guesclin. This extraordinary soldier started his career as a simple knight, but his intelligence and martial genius made him one of the most important commanders in France. Bertrand was a leader who turned the tide of the war. He used guerrilla tactics with small and fast troops against the large and flamboyant armies of the British. Under his command, French forces cut the enemy's logistical lines and wore down British troops with small but effective attacks. Bertrand's rise was not only a military success but also a beacon of hope for the people of France. Together, Charles V and Bertrand du Guesclin launched a major strategic struggle against English supremacy on French soil. One by one, the army of mercenaries began to take back castles and towns controlled by the English. In particular, strategic regions such as Normandy and Bretagne fell back into French hands. We might say that Charles conducted the war like a chessboard. He preferred to gradually corner the enemy rather than to win sudden victories on the battlefield. My friends, this resurgence of France brought not only a military but also a political awakening. Charles won the confidence of the people by reorganizing the tax system. The economy began to revive, cities were rebuilt, and most importantly, the people were no longer war-weary, but full of hope for victory. While the armies, led by Bertrand, wore down the enemy, Charles also achieved great diplomatic success. France's recovery meant a new challenge for England. No longer would France be remembered for its previous weakness, but for the resurgence of a nation. But, my friends, would the rise of France be enough to break England's resistance? And how would the rise of Bertrand de Guesclin bring a new dimension to the war? Let us seek the answers to these questions together. My dear friends, the fires of the battlefield seem to have died down for a while, but you know that this world is never still. For peace is sometimes only a harbinger of greater storms. During this pause in the 100 Years' War, France and England were riven by internal conflicts that were sharper than the swords of war. If anything can be more dangerous than the enemy's army, it is the division of a nation within itself. Let us take a look at those dark years in France and England. In France, Charles VI ascended the throne after the death of Charles V. He was a young king following a wise father. However, as fate would have it, Charles VI would eventually become known as the Mad King. There was a king on the throne, yes, but the throne of the minds was unfortunately ruled by other forces. The fluctuations in Charles's sanity left France in the hands of powerful ruling families. The Armagnac and Burgundian dynasties took advantage of this weak rule to fight each other for control of the country. While the Armagnacs represented France's traditional dynasty as the most influential group next to the king, the Burgundians, with their wealth and powerful alliances, were becoming a growing threat in the country's politics. These conflicts did not only remain within the palace walls, my dear friends, in the towns and villages of France too. The division tore deep wounds among the people. The struggle between the parties was so fierce that the interior of France was engulfed in a civil war. During these turmoil, even the threat from England became secondary. Imagine fighting your own people at home while there is an enemy outside. This was France's greatest misfortune during this period. But oh my friends, it was not only France, but also England that was plunged into its own dark years. Richard II, who sat on the throne of England, came to the throne at a young age and promised peace to his people. Unfortunately, this young king found it difficult to maintain his authority. His lack of political skill and loss of the people's trust caused Richard's throne to waver. In 1399, he was deposed by his cousin, Henry, Duke of Lancaster. Thus began the reign of Henry IV, which would mark an era in England. Henry IV had seized the throne, but this did not mean that everything was settled. His reign was marked by internal rebellions and unrest, especially in the north, on the Scottish border and in Wales. The Owen Glendower rebellion dragged Henry's rule from one test to another. Although England and France seem to have put aside the struggle on the battlefields during this period, internal unrest weakened both countries. But my friends, history teaches us this: weak moments are sometimes the starting point of the greatest battles. And how would France and England face each other again on the battlefield after these years of chaos? We will find the answer to that in a moment. My friends, I will now take you to one of the most epic scenes of the 100 Years' War. The year is 1415. A young king sits on the throne of England, Henry V, a bold, decisive, and overconfident monarch. But this confidence was not in vain. Henry was a military genius, unrivaled among kings. As a young man, he launched a great campaign to bring France back to its knees. In the summer of that year, when English ships crossed the English Channel and landed in northern France, no one could have predicted that the campaign would end in a victory that would go down in European history. The beginning of the campaign felt as if fate had a special trick in store for Henry. The French had not taken this English king seriously, but Henry's aim was great: to save England's honor and to strengthen his claim to the throne of France. But things were not easy from the start. Henry's army was mostly made up of tired, sick, and inexperienced soldiers. Starvation and disease weakened them further as they marched through France. So what do you think he did? Did he think of turning back? No, he did not. Henry motivated his soldiers with promises of victory and kept them moving forward, telling them that God was with them. And so on October 25th, 1415, near the village of Agincourt, the two armies faced each other. The English army was about 6,000 men, mostly archers, known for their famous longbows. Opposing them was a huge French army of almost 200, zero men. The French were so confident that they saw this battle as a decisive victory. But this is where Henry's genius came in. That morning, the battlefield was covered in mud. First it had rained, and then the mud, which made the ground heavy, had almost completely destroyed the French's ability to move. Henry did not hesitate to turn this situation to his advantage. He positioned the English army in a defensive position in a narrow space. He placed his archers along a line protected by stakes driven into the ground. When the French cavalry advanced, these stakes would be their nightmare. As the battle began, the deadly power of the English longbow was once again demonstrated. Their range and piercing effect paralyzed the French advance. As the cavalry trudged through the mud, English arrows rained down on them. The French were out of order, their splendid armor a weight. They could not advance, they could not escape. They perished in the mud. Henry's leadership was felt at every moment of the battle. He both encouraged the troops and patiently executed his strategy. For the French, this battle was not only a defeat but also a shame. According to historians' estimates, the French suffered around 100,000 casualties, while the British losses did not even reach 500. This was not just a victory, but an achievement that put Henry's name in gold letters in history. The Battle of Azincourt went down in history as one of England's greatest victories over France. But it was hard to predict what would happen after this victory. Would Henry's rise continue, or would this brilliant victory soon fade away? In the next installment, we will discover how this victory, followed by the Treaty of Troyes, propelled Henry to the throne of France and shaped the fate of two kingdoms. And what about you? Are you ready to hear the consequences of Henry's claim to the throne? Dear friends, now I will take you to the royal palaces where great games are played. From the muddy fields of Azincourt, the invincible reputation of King Henry V of England remained. This young king was not only a warrior, but also a diplomat, a strategist, and the architect of a grand plan. His victories on French soil allowed Henry to assert his claim to the throne more forcefully, but this required much more than a victory on the battlefield. Henry had his eyes on France itself. He wanted to be a ruler, not just a conqueror. And the road to this goal was paved with the Treaty of Troyes, signed in 1420. But how could a country like France agree to such a treaty? To understand this, let us visualize France at the time. The country was internally fragmented. The civil war between the Burgundian and Armagnac factions was like a knife in the heart of France. The people were tired, the armies were weak. And to top it all, the King of France, Charles VI, was mentally unstable. Known as the Mad King by historians, Charles could neither rule his country nor stand up to his enemies. In this chaos, Henry V's power grew irresistibly. On the path he had paved with his sword, Henry was now advancing with his intellect. In 1420, he negotiated the Treaty of Troyes. The terms of the treaty were humiliating for France and tantamount to victory for England. The Dauphin Charles the Dauphin, the legitimate heir to the French throne, was forced to renounce his right to the throne. Instead, King Charles VI agreed to marry his daughter Catherine to Henry V. This marriage was not just a family union, it meant that the two kingdoms would one day be united under the same crown. The Treaty of Troyes recognized Henry as the future king of France, not just a king. The most remarkable clause of the treaty was this: after the death of Charles VI, the throne of France would pass directly to Henry. This was a great victory for Henry. Now, England and France seemed to be united under Henry's rule. But this success was achieved not only by the power of his sword, but also by the sharpness of his mind. At this time, Henry's charisma and leadership were impressing not only his army, but also his allies. His marriage to Catherine became not only a political move, but also a ceremony symbolizing the union of two peoples. Stories circulated among the peoples that Henry was a king chosen by fate. But Henry's enemies were not idle. France's Crown Prince Charles refused to recognize the treaty and continued to resist. And this, my friends, is where we must ask, was Henry V really able to realize this dream? Was a world in which France, as a united kingdom, was dominated by England possible? Or would the dark hand of fate interrupt the young king's grand plans? In the next installment, I will describe the road to Henry's death and the resurgence of France in the shadow of this treaty. Are you ready? Ah, dear friends, I will now tell you about one of the most extraordinary figures in history, a young woman who shone in the midst of a legendary era, Joan of Arc. This story is not only about victories on the battlefields, but an epic of faith, perseverance, and destiny. Even after King Henry V paved his way to the throne of France with the Treaty of Troyes, the people of France were losing hope. The English had captured the heart of France and laid siege to important cities like Orléans. It was at this point that the miraculous figure who changed the course of history appeared on the scene. A peasant girl in armor, believed to be sent by God. Joan of Arc was born in the small village called Domremy in the north of France. The daughter of a farming family, even as a child she was different from others. Legends say that when she was only 13 years old, she began to hear voices from heaven. These voices told her that she was God's chosen one and that she must save France. These divine messages from Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret resonated in young Jean's soul. Although others did not believe she had heard these voices, Jeannie never doubted the authenticity of the call. At the time, France had a young and weak king on the throne, Charles VII. Helpless in the face of England's supremacy, Charles was incapable of defending his kingdom. But Jeanne knew that the liberation of Orleans was the key to both the resurgence of France and to cementing Charles's claim to the throne. Of course, at the time it was almost impossible for a peasant girl to go before the king and explain her ideas, but Jeanne overcame all obstacles with her determination. With a determination all her own, she went to Charles's palace and convinced him that she was on a divine mission. The Siege of Orléans, led by Jeanne, is one of the most striking moments in history. In the spring of 1429, at the head of the French army, this young woman motivated the soldiers not only with her tactics, but also with her faith. Dressed in her armor and carrying a sacred flag, Jeanne boosted the morale of the soldiers. Under her leadership, the French attacked the British with incredible energy. And finally, the long siege ended. Orléans was liberated, the people's hope was revived, and the fate of France began to change. With this victory, Jeanne became a warrior saint in the eyes of the people and a threat to the English. But, as in every heroine story, Jeanne's path led to a difficult end. The triumph of Orléans and the successes that followed made her star shine brightly, but her rise was the envy and hatred of many. In 1430, she was captured by the Burgundian army and handed over to the English. Jeanne was no longer just a warrior, but a symbol in the eyes of England and her French opponents. To silence her, they wanted to defeat her not only physically but also spiritually. The trial in Rouen was a time when not only Jeanne's faith was tested, but also that of France. Jeanne was accused of heresy and witchcraft, but no matter what, she did not bow down in court. Without averting her eyes, she stood tall and said that she only served God and fought to save her people. Unfortunately, this courage was not enough to save him. On May 30, 1431, Jeanne, only 19 years old, was tied to a stake and burned alive in the square of Rouen. But the flames consumed only Jeanne's body. Her faith, her courage, and her place in the hearts of her people remained forever. Jeanne's death was a turning point for France. Her sacrifice reunited the people and ignited the resistance against the British. The epic of Joan of Arc's heroism continues to echo in the heart of France forever. But dear friends, let us ask this: was Jean's sacrifice enough to save France? Was the hope born in her flames strong enough to break the power of England? In the next installment, we will witness the rise of France again. Ah, my friends, after a long and painful journey, the light is finally beginning to shine on the horizon of France. In the wake of Joan of Arc's tragic end, the people of France surrendered neither to sorrow nor frustration. Her sacrifice has revitalized the blood that flows in the veins of France. However, the British were still in power, still inflicting deep wounds on French soil. At this point, a new leader was needed to save France. That leader was Charles VII, who was no longer just a king, but a strategist who rebuilt his nation. Charles VII was a monarch born out of the chaos inherited by his father, Charles VI. He had been fighting the royalists for a long time, but he had to prove that he really deserved the throne. His first order of business was to make radical changes not only on the battlefield but also in the political and military structure of France. Charles decided to modernize his army. He replaced the traditional feudal armies with a more organized and disciplined military structure. He also introduced financial reforms and a regular tax system to meet the needs of the army. The army was now becoming a force based on strategy and organization, not just on luck or individual heroism. These reforms changed the fate of French military power. Wars with the English were no longer mere resistance but planned attacks, and the first fruits of this change finally came at the Battle of Formigny in 1450. The English suffered a heavy defeat in Normandy. France was once again in the euphoria of liberating its own territory. But this victory was only a precursor to the grand finale. That grand finale would be engraved in the history books as the Battle of Castillon. Now we come to 1453, my friends. The last major battle of the war took place on the soil of Castillon. The English still held important strongholds in the south of France. Areas like Bordeaux were under English rule, and England did not want to lose control of these territories. But the French now had a completely different army. With their artillery, disciplined infantry, and strong leadership, Charles VII's soldiers were determined for victory over the English. Castillon is considered one of the first modern battles in the history of warfare. The French used heavy artillery against the English, and this decided the fate of the battle. The British army relied on its traditional archer strength, but the French artillery units tore the British ranks to shreds. During the fighting, the British initially seemed to see a glimmer of hope, but were defeated by the overwhelming power of the French army. In the fall of Bordeaux, Britain lost its hold on France for good. The Battle of Castillon marked the beginning of a new era, not only for France, but also for European history. And so, my friends, the 100 Years' War came to a conclusion. France was reunited, regained the national identity, and completely erased the English threat from its territory. But the new Europe that emerged in the wake of this victory heralded a completely different world. Feudalism was slowly disappearing from the stage of history, and the foundations of modern states were being laid. But what happened in Europe after France's victory? What path did England follow after this defeat? Let's trace these great transformations together. Ah, my dear friends, sometimes a war ends, swords are sheathed, but the aftershocks are felt for many years. The 100 Years' War was just such a storm. It was a turning point that affected not only France and England, but the whole of Europe, shattering the foundations of the old order. Now, I will tell you how Europe changed in the aftermath of this gigantic conflict. Get ready, because this is not a story of swords, but of people, fields, and trade routes. The war shattered not only armies, but also the fabric of the feudal system. In the old days, each noble gathered his own soldiers, and local lords maintained their power. But a protracted conflict like the 100 Years' War pushed this system to its limits. Mercenaries became increasingly important on both sides of the war. The small units of feudal lords were inadequate against the professional armies. Mercenaries fought for whoever had the money and valued gold more than loyalty. This led to war becoming not only a struggle for power, but also an economic competition. It was no longer only the will of a king that mattered, but also the strength of his treasury. This reduced the importance of feudal lords and strengthened the central authority of kings. But mercenaries did not always keep order, my dear friends. Unemployed in peacetime, these warriors tried to make a living by pillaging, plundering villages and trade routes. They were a direct byproduct of war, sowing fear and chaos among the people. Thus, the old order was destabilized, and peasants left their lands in search of a new life. Further, the deepest wounds of the war was inflicted on agriculture. Years of conflict destroyed not only the land, but also the hands that worked it. The fertile fields of France turned into battlefields. Villages were burned, harvests were plundered, and hunger gripped the population like an invisible enemy in the wake of war. As farmers struggled to survive, instead of growing their crops, the rural economy began to collapse. But it was not only the fields that suffered from the turmoil, but also the trade routes. Europe's major trade networks suffered blow after blow in the shadow of war. Merchants could not find safe routes to transport their goods, and the markets of cities remained empty. The great economic arteries stretching from the Mediterranean to northern Europe were drying up because of the war. The harbors, once bustling with ships full of silk and spices, were now silent. This affected not only merchants, but also city dwellers. The decline in trade increased unemployment and poverty in the cities. At the same time, the tax burden of the war weighed heavily on the shoulders of the people. But my friends, after every catastrophe comes a rebirth, doesn't it? And in this chaos, the old order of Europe was collapsing, but a new world was being born. Mechanical innovations in agriculture, the revival of commerce in the cities, and the rise of nation-states. All this was beginning to sprout in the vacuum created by the war. But let me ask you this. Was it only the war that sparked this change? Or was it humanity's longing for a new era? Let's look at the roots of this great transformation together in the next chapter. Ah, my dear friends, the 100 Years' War is over. and the swords are beginning to rust. But after this long and grueling conflict, it was not just ruined fields and fallen castles. No, the legacy of this war was much deeper. The battle cry that echoed across the land was replaced by a new consciousness, sprouting in the hearts of peoples: national identity. On separate paths, but parallel to each other, France and Britain began to take the first steps towards nation-states. It was the end of the old world and the beginning of a new order. Let's start with France. The French army, shaped by Charles VII's reforms, was not just a military instrument. It was a symbol of the nation's strength and the solidarity of the people. The torch of hope lit by Joan of Arc not only drove out enemies but also rekindled the self-confidence of the French people. No longer did the French see themselves only as members of a local lord or a feudal principality, but as part of a larger whole, France. This consciousness was the cornerstone of France's national identity. But national identity manifested itself not only in the psyche of the people, but also in the power structure of the monarchy. While the power of the nobility weakened during the 100 Years' War, the authority of the king was further consolidated. Charles VII and the French kings who followed him established a centralized administration and took control of the country in their hands. The old feudal order was replaced by a nation united under a single flag, loyal to the king. This was the beginning of a new era for France, the epic of the birth of a nation. On the other hand, England. England, with what she gained and what she lost in this war. She forged her own path. At the end of the war, the British domination of French territory was almost completely over. But this loss played an important role in shaping Britain's own identity. The British were now moving away from the dream of an empire that would dominate continental Europe and focusing on consolidating their power in their islands. In this period, the English people, like the French, began to see themselves as part of a larger whole, the Kingdom of England. In Britain's politics, the waves of the war caused major changes. The English monarchy failed to establish a centralized authority, as in France. On the contrary, the power of feudal lords and institutions such as Parliament limited the authority of kings. This paved the way for England's future evolution towards a constitutional monarchy. The taxes collected and the regulations passed during the 100 Years' War marked the beginning of popular involvement in the political process. But, my friends, the legacy of the war was not limited to these two countries. The whole of Europe changed in the shadow of the 100 Years' War. As the era of feudal lords came to a close, kings and nation-states came on the scene. The borders of the old world were blurred. Peoples were loyal to their local lords and did not see themselves as part of a larger identity. But war drew borders, defined identities, and made peoples more closely bound together. Europe was no longer witnessing the rise of a handful of feudal principalities, but of nation-states. But, my dear friends, was the birth of these nation-states merely a political order, or was it a new expression of the dreams, fears, and hopes of peoples? In our next story, we will explore together how this new order took shape and how national identities transformed the world. Are you ready? My dear friends. You see, history is not just a collection of events that happened in the past. It is a deep tapestry of stories that tell how our world today was shaped, that make us human. The heroes of these ancient times that I have told you about today, the rise and fall, the innovations that pushed the limits of human genius, all these are not only echoes of the past, but bridges to the future. And what about you? Did you feel like you were on a battlefield as you listened to these stories? Or were you listening to whispers echoing in the dark corridors of a palace? Perhaps you shared the excitement of a scientist's meticulously recorded discoveries. Each one is our story, my friends. And we must not forget that history is another name for the echoes of the human spirit in time. That's all for today, but I would like to say goodbye by asking you something. What do you think? What do you think's the next story that will shed light on the future from the shadows of the past? The next time we meet, we will come together again to discover together a never immediately fascinating story from another corner of human history. Get ready, because history is never finished. Now go and fill your day with history. But remember, my friends, we will meet again in our next story.